The fire crackles in this Roman study. The flames cast shadows on ancient walls. Outside, the world sleeps. But here, we remember. Tonight, hero or enemy. His name was Spartacus, a slave who became a legend, a gladiator who forged an army of 70,000 and brought Rome to its knees. For 2 years, from 73 to 71 BCE, his rebellion raged across Italy, defeating Roman legions, freeing thousands of slaves, threatening the most powerful republic in the ancient world. He died fighting. His body was never found. 6,000 of his followers were crucified along the Appian Way as a warning. To Rome, he was an enemy, a terrorist, a threat to civilization itself. To the slaves who followed him, he was hope, proof that even the powerless could fight back. 2,000 years later, we still ask, was Spartacus a hero fighting for freedom, or a rebel leading thousands to pointless death? The ancient sources, all written by his Roman enemies, give us fragments, contradictions, glimpses of a man they feared but couldn't help admiring. By the end of this story, you'll know what Spartacus did, what he fought for, and how he died. You'll have the evidence. History cannot answer the question. Only you can. Hero or enemy? You decide. The story begins in the spring of 73, before the Common Era, in the city of Capua, 25 kilometers north of Naples, in a gladiator school where 78 men were about to change history. Rest now, and listen. Capua, spring of 73, before the Common Era. Imagine the city as it stood 2,000 years ago. Stone walls rising thick and ancient, built by the Etruscans centuries before Rome ever dreamed of empire. Beyond those walls, the fertile plains of Campania stretched in every direction, fields of wheat, vineyards climbing gentle hills, olive groves where ancient trees twisted toward the southern sun. Campania was blessed land. The volcanic soil, enriched by Vesuvius in ages past, produced the finest crops in Italy. The wine of this region was prized across the Mediterranean. The grain fed Rome's masses, and the wealth this produced made Capua the second richest city in all of Italy. 25 kilometers north of the Bay of Naples, Capua bustled with trade. Its forum filled each day with merchants from across the known world. Phoenicians offering purple dye from Tyre, Greek potters displaying painted vases, Roman businessmen negotiating contracts. The sound of a dozen languages mingling in the warm air. But Capua was famous for something else, something darker. Gladiator schools. There were several such facilities in the city. Training grounds where slaves were transformed into fighters, where men learned to kill for entertainment, where the condemned and the captured were molded into Rome's favorite spectacle. The largest and most prestigious belonged to a man named Lentulus Batiatus. His ludus, his gladiator school, stood near the center of Capua. Walls of stone 15 feet high, topped with sharpened wooden palisades, guard towers at the corners, manned day and night. A massive oak gate reinforced with iron, kept locked except when gladiators were being moved or when wealthy Romans came to inspect the merchandise. Because that's what gladiators were under Roman law. Merchandise, property, investments to be bought and sold and rented out for profit. Inside this fortress lived 78 men, 78 slaves who had been purchased or condemned to train as gladiators. Men from across Rome's vast empire, Gauls from the north, Greeks, Syrians, Germans, Africans, the conquered peoples of the Mediterranean, forced to kill each other for Roman entertainment. Among these 78 was a man named Spartacus. Listen closely now. This is where the story truly begins. We know frustratingly little about Spartacus before this moment. The ancient sources written by Romans, written by his enemies, give us only fragments, glimpses of a man they feared and could not fully understand. Plutarch, the Greek historian writing 150 years after Spartacus's death, tells us he was Thracian, from the mountains of what we now call Bulgaria, where warlike tribes had resisted Roman conquest for generations. The Thracians were famous warriors, fierce, skilled, proud. They served as mercenaries for Greek kings and Persian emperors. They fought with distinctive curved swords and small shields. They did not submit easily to foreign rule, but somehow Spartacus ended up in chains, in Italy, in Batiatus's ludus in Capua. How? The sources don't tell us. Perhaps he was captured in war. Rome was constantly fighting in Thrace, and prisoners of war were routinely enslaved. Perhaps he had served as a soldier in Roman auxiliary forces and deserted, and enslavement was his punishment. Perhaps slave traders captured him, or enemies sold him. We don't know. What we do know is what Plutarch tells us. Spartacus possessed not only great courage and strength, but but also intelligence and culture superior to his condition, and more like a Greek than a Thracian. Think about what this means. Intelligence and culture, the ability to speak Greek, the language of philosophy and learning in the ancient world. This suggests education, perhaps noble birth in his homeland. Spartacus was not just another slave, he was exceptional. Appian, another ancient historian, calls him a Thracian of nomadic stock, possessed not only of great courage and strength, but also of intelligence. Even Florus, who despises Spartacus and calls the rebellion shameful for Rome, admits his military skill. The Romans feared him. Even in their histories, written to justify crushing his rebellion, they cannot help but acknowledge what he was, a born leader, a natural warrior. A man who in different circumstances might have commanded legions for Rome rather than against it, but circumstances placed him in a cell in Batiatus's Ludus, training every day to fight in the arena, preparing to die for the entertainment of crowds who would cheer his death. The days in the Ludus followed the same pattern. Dawn brought training, hours of drilling with wooden practice weapons, learning the techniques that might keep a gladiator alive for one more fight. Meals were barley and beans, food designed to build muscle and weight. Afternoons brought rest, medical treatment for injuries, massage for sore muscles. Not out of compassion, but economics, gladiators were valuable property, and Bartio wanted to protect his investments. At night, the gladiators were locked in their cells. Small rooms built into the thick stone walls. Dark, cramped spaces barely large enough to lie down. Some men were chained. All were watched by guards who patrolled the corridors, ensuring no trouble, no escape attempts, no rebellion. But in those cells, in the darkness, men talked, whispered, planned. According to Plutarch, in the spring of 73 BCE, approximately 200 gladiators in Batiatus's school plotted to escape. 200 men. Think about what this means. 200 slaves who had decided that even death was preferable to continuing this life, who looked around at the stone walls and iron gates and armed guards and said, "We will risk everything for freedom." They planned in secret. They had to. Discovery would mean immediate and terrible punishment. Crucifixion, perhaps? Nailed to a wooden cross? Left to die slowly over days? Or damnatio ad bestias, being torn apart by wild animals in the arena while crowds cheered? Or simply beaten to death as an example to the others? But somehow, through carelessness or malice or simply bad luck, the plot was discovered. Perhaps another gladiator informed Batiatus, seeking favour or fearing the consequences of remaining silent. Perhaps a guard overheard a whispered conversation. Perhaps the conspiracy simply grew too large to keep secret. The sources don't tell us how it was betrayed, only that it was. The word spread through the Ludus like fire. They know. The overseers know. Guards are coming to arrest the conspirators. Most of the 200 were caught immediately, seized in their cells or grabbed during the morning assembly, dragged before Batiatus, condemned. But 78 men, Spartacus among them, learned of the betrayal in time. Picture that moment, the sudden realization that there are no more hours to plan, no more days to prepare. The conspiracy is exposed. Guards are coming. This is the moment. Now or never. Freedom or death. 78 men made their choice. They attacked. Appian describes what happened next. The gladiators, knowing they were about to be arrested, knowing they faced torture and execution, decided to act immediately, but they had no weapons. The real gladiae, the short swords of steel, were kept locked away, guarded, only brought out for actual arena combat. So they armed themselves with whatever they could find. They burst into the Ludus's kitchen. The sources are specific about this detail. Kitchen knives, the heavy cleavers used for butchering meat, the sharp blades for cutting vegetables, cooking spits, long iron rods used for roasting meat over fires. Not proper weapons, but deadly enough in the hands of men trained to kill. Armed with these crude implements, fueled by desperate fury, 78 enslaved men fought their way out of one of Capua's most secure facilities. They killed guards who tried to stop them. The sources don't give us details, but we can imagine the scenes. A guard drawing his sword, confident in his authority, in his right to command these slaves, and then a gladiator, perhaps Spartacus himself, driving a kitchen knife into the guard's throat, blood spraying, the guard falling, his sword seized by hands that knew exactly how to use it. Throughout the Ludus, chaos erupted. Shouts and screams, the clash of improvised weapons against proper swords. Men fighting with the desperation of those who know surrender means death. And then they were at the main gate. That massive barrier of oak and iron, designed to contain them, to keep them imprisoned forever. 78 men, fighting together, broke through. Splintered wood, forced iron, burst out into the streets of Capua. Imagine the city's reaction. The shock rippling outward from Batiatus's ludus. Escaped gladiators, slaves with weapons running through the streets. Horns began to blow. Alarm spreading through Capua like waves across water. The city guard mobilizing. Citizens scrambling for weapons or barricading themselves in their homes. Batiatus's men organizing pursuit. The hunt beginning. But Spartacus and his 77 companions did not try to hide in Capua. They knew that would be suicide. The city was Roman territory. Every free citizen they encountered would see them as nothing more than runaway property to be captured and returned. Instead, they ran through the streets, out through the city gates, into the countryside beyond, moving as fast as exhausted, desperate men could move. Every second mattered, every heartbeat counted, and then fortune smiled. The gods favored them, if you believed in such things. Pure impossible luck. On the road out of Capua, the gladiators encountered commercial wagons, merchants transporting goods to market, and among those goods, Plutarch is specific about this remarkable coincidence: gladiatorial equipment, swords, shields, armor, perhaps a shipment destined for another ludus, perhaps equipment being delivered to sponsors of upcoming games. The gladiators seized these wagons. They tore open the cargo and armed themselves properly. Suddenly Spartacus held not a kitchen knife but a real gladius. 2 pounds of steel, 2 feet long, double-edged. The weapon Roman legions had used to conquer the Mediterranean world. He took a shield, the small rectangular shield of a Thrax, the Thracian fighting style he would have trained in. He took armor, whatever fit. Around him, his companions did the same. 78 men, most of them trained gladiators, now armed with proper weapons, no longer fugitives with improvised arms, warriors. And here, according to the ancient sources, something crucial happened. The 78 chose Spartacus as their leader. The sources don't tell us if this was a vote, an acclamation, or if Spartacus simply assumed command through force of personality. But from this moment forward, he was more than one escaped slave among many. He was the commander, the decision-maker, the man they would follow, and Spartacus made his first strategic decision. They would head for Mount Vesuvius. The great volcano rose to the south, visible from Capua when the sky was clear. In 73 BCE, Vesuvius was considered extinct, its last eruption lost in distant prehistory. Its slopes were green with forests and vineyards, wild and defensible. If they could reach Vesuvius, if they could find a strong position on its heights, they might survive long enough to what? Escape Italy, fight their way to freedom. The sources suggest even Spartacus didn't know yet, only that they needed time, space, a place to catch their breath and decide what came next. So the 78 gladiators marched south, toward the mountain. Behind them, Capua erupted into fury. Batiatus's wealth damaged, his reputation shattered. 78 valuable gladiators gone, guards dead. The unthinkable had happened. Messages raced toward Rome. Escaped gladiators, armed and dangerous. Send soldiers, deal with this, quickly, before other slaves see this example and get ideas, before the contagion spreads. Rome, confident in its overwhelming power, sent soldiers to crush what it saw as a minor problem. They sent Gaius Claudius Glaber, a praetor, one of Rome's elected magistrates who held imperium, military command authority. Glaber assembled approximately 3,000 men, not professional legionaries from Rome's regular legions, but militia, local forces, soldiers scraped together quickly from the surrounding territories. It should have been more than enough. 3,000 armed men against 78 fugitive slaves. The math seemed absurdly in Rome's favour. Glaber marched south from Capua, following reports, tracking the fugitives. He found them on Mount Vesuvius. The gladiators had climbed to the summit, to a position in or near the old crater, the ancient caldera from some eruption long before human memory. Here they made camp, defensible ground, steep approaches, a natural fortress. Glaber saw their position and made what seemed like a wise decision. Rather than assault them up difficult slopes where even 78 trained fighters could inflict serious casualties on attackers struggling uphill, he would besiege them. He deployed his 3,000 soldiers around the base of Vesuvius. Not a complete encirclement. That would require far more troops, but a blocking of the main descent routes, guards on the paths, patrols watching the slopes, a net to catch the fugitives when they tried to come down, and then Glaber waited. It was sound strategy. Time was on Rome's side. The gladiators had no supply lines. They might find water on the mountain springs fed the slopes, but food? How long could 78 men survive on whatever they could forage? Days, perhaps? A week or two if they were resourceful and lucky. But not forever? Eventually hunger would drive them down. They would surrender or attempt a desperate breakout, and Glaber's 3,000 would be waiting. So Glaber made camp at the base of the mountain. His men cooked meals and told stories and threw dice. They watched the slopes above, confident. The fugitives were trapped. On Vesuvius, Spartacus looked down at the Roman campfires twinkling below in the dusk, and he thought, what was he thinking? The sources don't tell us, but they tell us what he did. The slopes of Vesuvius were thick with wild grapevines, tough, fibrous vines that had grown for years, spreading through the forest, thick as a man's wrist in places. Spartacus ordered his men to cut these vines, to gather them, to weave them together, twisting the strands into long, strong ropes. And then, when darkness fell, when Glaber's men were settling into their evening routines, when the watch was focused on the expected routes down, Spartacus led his gladiators to the opposite side of the mountain. Here, the slopes were sheer, cliffs of rock, nearly vertical, impassable, or so the Romans assumed. This is why Glaber hadn't bothered to guard this side heavily. Why waste troops watching slopes no one could possibly descend? Both Plutarch and Appian describe what happened next, and their accounts agree on the essential, incredible details. Using the woven vine ropes, the gladiators descended those cliffs in darkness, one by one, hand over hand, lowering themselves down rock faces that should have been impassable, trusting their strength, trusting the ropes, trusting Spartacus's plan. 78 men descended sheer slopes in the night. Not one fell, not one rope broke. All 78 made it down safely. And then, before dawn, while darkness still covered their movements, they circled around Glaber's position. The Romans had positioned themselves to watch the mountain above. Their sentries faced upward. Their camp was organized to respond to an attack from the slopes. They never expected attack from behind, from below, from the direction they considered safe. Spartacus struck at first light. The gladiators came at the Roman camp from the rear. They attacked at dawn, that vulnerable moment when sleep still fogs the mind, when the body is stiff, when reaction times are slow. Appian describes the result: panic, chaos. The Roman militia waking to find armed gladiators among them, not trapped on the mountain, but here, now, in the camp, killing. They broke. These were not professional soldiers. These were hastily assembled locals who had expected to conduct a siege, to wait out a few desperate fugitives. They had not trained for close-quarters combat against skilled fighters. The gladiators, by contrast, were professionals. They had spent years learning to fight, to kill efficiently, to survive through skill and ruthlessness. And now they fought not for entertainment, but for their lives. The battle was brief. Glaber's forces scattered. They fled. The camp was overrun. Glaber himself barely escaped. Plutarch records that the praetor fled with his life but little else. Humiliated, defeated by slaves he had thought were trapped and helpless. When the sun rose fully over Vesuvius that morning, 78 gladiators stood amid a captured Roman military camp. Spartacus now possessed real military equipment, proper gladii, large rectangular shields, scooter, throwing spears, pila, armor and helmets, everything a Roman soldier carried. The gladiators threw away their arena equipment and armed themselves as legionaries. But more than weapons, Spartacus had won something profound. A victory, a real, undeniable, shocking victory over Roman forces. Think about what this meant. 78 slaves had defeated 3,000 Roman soldiers. The impossible had happened. News spread. In an age before mass communication, information still travelled. Merchants carried stories from town to town. Travellers gossiped at inns and way stations. And slaves working in fields and mines and workshops across Campania, they whispered to each other, passed along news their masters tried to suppress. The story was too incredible not to tell. Escaped gladiators had beaten a Roman praetor. Slaves had won. And across Campania, across all of southern Italy, other slaves listened. And they began to hope. The Roman economy ran on slavery. Millions of enslaved people worked the estates and mines and workshops of Italy. They had been captured in Rome's endless wars, born into bondage, sold by pirates and slave traders. They had no rights under Roman law. They were property, less than human in the eyes of their masters. Most accepted their fate because they had no choice. Resistance meant death. Escape was impossible. Rome's authority covered all of Italy. Where would a slave run? But now, suddenly, there was somewhere to run. There was an army that would accept them. There was Spartacus. They came in ones and twos at first. Agricultural slaves who slipped away from their masters' estates in the night. Shepherds who abandoned their flocks in the hills. House slaves who fled from wealthy villas. Men and women who had endured lives of toil and abuse and hopelessness, who now saw a chance, however slim, at freedom. They made their way to Vesuvius, to Spartacus's camp, and Spartacus accepted them all. His army grew, from 78 to hundreds, then to thousands, but this created a challenge. The original 78 were gladiators, trained warriors who knew how to fight, but these agricultural slaves, they knew how to plant grain and harvest grapes. They knew how to shear sheep and prune olive trees. Most had never held a weapon beyond a farming tool. Spartacus had to train them. According to Plutarch, he organized his growing force, imposed discipline, drilled them in basic combat techniques. It was hasty training compared to the years of instruction in a ludus. But it was something. It gave them courage. It gave them hope that they could defend themselves, could fight, could survive, and Spartacus established a crucial principle that bound his army together. According to Plutarch, the spoils of war were divided equally among all fighters. No commander's share. No special privileges for leaders. Everything taken from the Romans, weapons, food, money, goods, would be split evenly. This was radical. Revolutionary. In the ancient world, commanders took the largest share. It was expected, normal, the natural order of things. But Spartacus rejected that. He showed his followers that he was not another master, seeking to exploit them. He was one of them, an equal. This built loyalty. Men fought harder knowing they would share equally in victory. They trusted Spartacus because he treated them not as subordinates but as comrades. The army continued to grow. By summer of 73 BCE, Spartacus commanded several thousand fighters. They were no longer just a band of fugitives. They were an army. He led them in raids across Campania. Not random violence, but strategic attacks. They targeted the estates of wealthy Romans, the sprawling villas where hundreds of slaves labored in the fields producing grain and wine and olive oil that enriched their masters. Spartacus's forces would descend on an estate, defeat or kill the guards, free the slaves who worked there, and invite them to join the rebellion. They seized food and supplies. They took weapons and armor. Sometimes they burned the master's villa to the ground, leaving it in ruins. Each successful raid brought more recruits. Slaves across the region saw that Spartacus could win, could provide protection, could offer something better than enslavement. The army swelled, 10,000, 15,000, 20,000. Rome, finally beginning to take the threat seriously, sent another force. This time the commander was Publius Varinius, another praetor. He commanded a larger army than Glaber, perhaps 4,000 to 6,000 men, and Varinius was more competent, more careful, more prepared for actual warfare than his predecessor. It didn't matter. It didn't matter. Spartacus defeated him too. The sources are frustratingly vague on the details of this campaign. Appian and Plutarch give only outlines, not the full narrative. But they agree on the outcome. Varinius's army was routed, his camp was captured, and the praetor himself fled in such desperate haste that he left behind his fasces, the bundle of rods with an axe blade that symbolized his authority as a Roman magistrate. This was more than a military defeat. It was a symbolic humiliation. The fasces represented Rome's power, Rome's law, Rome's right to command. For a praetor to lose his fasces to slaves was shameful beyond measure. It suggested that Rome's authority itself could be challenged, could be defeated, could be taken by force. By the end of 73 BCE, by the time winter began to close in, Spartacus commanded an army estimated at 20,000 to 30,000. Some ancient sources claim even higher numbers, though ancient historians notoriously exaggerated army sizes. Even if we discount the highest estimates, it's clear Spartacus's rebellion had grown into something massive. Two separate Roman military expeditions, commanded by praetors with imperium, had been crushed. Southern Italy was in chaos. Wealthy Romans fled their estates. Trade routes were disrupted. Roman authority in the region had collapsed. This was no longer a minor slave uprising. This was a crisis threatening the Republic itself. Among Spartacus's followers were the other gladiators who had escaped with him from Batiatus's Ludus. 3 names survived in the ancient sources, preserved because they became leaders in their own right. Crixus, a Gaul, a fierce warrior. He commanded the loyalty of many Celtic slaves, Gauls and Germans who had been captured in Rome's northern wars and sold into slavery in Italy. Castus, also Gallic, also a respected fighter among the gladiators. Gannicus, another Gaul, another skilled warrior. These 3 became Spartacus's lieutenants. But as we'll see, they didn't always agree with him. Different visions, different goals, different ideas about what this rebellion should become. But for now, as winter approached and the campaigning season ended, Spartacus had achieved something remarkable. He had transformed 78 escaped gladiators into an army of tens of thousands. He had defeated every Roman force sent against him. He had proven that slaves could organize, could fight, could win. Rome watched. And Rome was afraid. And Rome was afraid. The fire crackles softly in this ancient study. The flames cast dancing shadows on the walls. Rest now. Breathe. The rebellion has begun, and it has shocked the Republic. But the greatest battles, the bloodiest confrontations, still lie ahead. The story continues. The year turned. 73 BCE became 72 BCE. Winter settled over Italy, not the harsh winters of the north, but still cold enough that armies stayed in camp, that campaign seasons paused, that even slaves huddled around fires and waited for spring. Spartacus's army wintered in southern Italy, 20 to 30,000 strong now, no longer just fighters, but families. Women had joined, wives who had fled with their husbands, mothers who had brought their children, female slaves who saw in Spartacus's rebellion their only chance at freedom. This was not just a military force. It was a community of the formerly enslaved, a moving city of people who had chosen freedom over safety, who had decided that possible death was better than certain bondage. Listen to what this meant. Imagine 30,000 people, men, women, children, living outside the structures of Roman society. No masters, no overseers, no one to tell them when to work, when to rest, when to live, when to die. For the first time in their lives, they were free, but freedom brought challenges. How do you feed 30,000 people when you control no territory, own no farms, have no supply lines? How do you keep order among people from a dozen different cultures who share only their past enslavement? How do you maintain an army when most of your fighters are farmers and shepherds who have barely held a weapon before? Spartacus faced these questions through that winter, and the ancient sources tell us he succeeded. His army remained organized, disciplined, united. Plutarch tells us that Spartacus divided the plunder equally. This wasn't just about fairness, though that mattered. It was strategy. It kept the army together. Men fought harder when they knew they would share in victory. They stayed loyal when their commander treated them as equals, not as subjects. But Spartacus's army was not entirely unified. Remember the 3 other gladiators who had escaped with him from Batiatus's Ludus: Crixus, Castus, and Gannicus. All Gauls, all commanding their own followers. Crixus especially commanded fierce loyalty from the Celtic slaves, the Gauls and Germans who had been captured in Rome's northern wars. These men remembered their homelands, remembered freedom before Rome came, and Crixus spoke their language, understood their culture, shared their background. As winter turned to spring in 72 BCE, tensions within the rebel army began to surface. Different leaders, different priorities, different visions of what this rebellion should become. The sources suggest a fundamental disagreement emerged. Spartacus, according to Plutarch, wanted to lead his army north, to march toward the Alps, to cross those mountains and escape Italy entirely, to return to their homelands, to Thrace for Spartacus, to Gaul for the Celts, to wherever these enslaved people had been taken from. It was an escape plan, a withdrawal. Not conquest, not revolution, but simply getting out of Roman territory and going home. But others disagreed. Many of Spartacus's followers were Italian-born, enslaved in Italy, raised in Italy, with no homeland to return to beyond these borders. For them, leaving Italy meant nothing. They had nowhere to go, and some Crixus among them, the sources suggest, wanted to stay and fight, to continue raiding, to punish Rome, to take revenge for years of abuse, to keep this rebellion going for as long as possible. As spring arrived and the campaign season opened, this disagreement came to a head. But first, Rome mobilized. The Senate had watched the winter with growing alarm. 2 praetors defeated, An army of tens of thousands of rebellious slaves controlling southern Italy. This could not stand. This threatened everything. If Spartacus was allowed to succeed, what would stop every slave in Italy from rising up? What would stop the millions of enslaved people who worked the farms and mines and workshops from joining him? The entire Roman economy, the entire Roman way of life depended on slavery remaining stable, accepted, unquestioned. Spartacus questioned it. Spartacus showed that slaves could organize and fight and win. That could not be allowed to continue. Both consular armies marched south in early 72 BCE, hunting for Spartacus. And then, before they could engage him, Spartacus's army split. Crixus broke away. He took with him approximately 30,000 fighters, mostly Gauls and Germans who shared his background and followed his leadership. The sources suggest this was about half of Spartacus's total force. Why did Crixus separate? Plutarch and Appian both mention this split, but give frustratingly few details about the cause. They suggest Crixus wanted to remain in Italy and continue raiding, while Spartacus insisted on marching north toward escape. Perhaps it was strategic disagreement. Perhaps it was personal rivalry. Two strong leaders who could no longer work together. Perhaps it was cultural divisions. Celtic slaves preferring to follow one of their own, rather than a Thracian. Whatever the cause, the rebel army divided. Spartacus continued north with perhaps 30 to 40,000 followers. Crixus went his own way, heading toward Apulia in southeastern Italy with his 30,000. This division was catastrophic. It weakened both forces, and Rome, recognizing the opportunity, struck. The consul Gellius Publicola found Crixus and his army near Mount Garganus in Apulia. The sources don't give us details of the battle. We don't know the tactics, the terrain, the specific actions that decided the outcome. But we know the result, and it was brutal. Crixus was defeated, and Crixus was killed. Appian tells us that 2/3 of Crixus's army died in the battle or in the route that followed. If Crixus commanded 30,000, that means 20,000 dead, 20,000 former slaves who had tasted freedom, who had followed a leader they trusted, cut down by Roman legions. The survivors scattered. Some may have tried to rejoin Spartacus. Some may have attempted to flee north on their own. Most were probably hunted down and killed, or recaptured in the days and weeks following the battle. It was Rome's first major victory in this war. After months of humiliating defeats, Roman legions had crushed a large rebel force and killed one of Spartacus's chief lieutenants. Gellius Publicola celebrated. He held gladiatorial games, forcing captured rebels to fight to the death in honor of his victory. The irony was cruel. Former gladiators who had escaped that fate, now forced to die as gladiators once again. Entertainment for Romans. Death for slaves who had dared to dream of freedom. News of Crixus's defeat reached Spartacus as he marched north through Italy. And here we see something of the man's character, filtered through hostile Roman sources, that nevertheless preserved this detail. Plutarch tells us that Spartacus mourned Crixus. Despite their disagreement, despite the split, Spartacus honored his fallen comrade. The sources record that Spartacus held funeral games for Crixus, but not Roman-style games. Instead, he forced 300 captured Roman prisoners to fight as gladiators, to die in combat the way slaves had been forced to die for Roman entertainment. It was vengeance. It was justice from the rebels' perspective, making Romans experience what they had inflicted on others. It was also a message to Rome. Spartacus would not show mercy. This was a war to the death. But Spartacus also knew that Crixus's defeat changed everything. Rome's consular armies were closing in. Both Gellius and Lentulus were now hunting him. He needed to move quickly. He turned and struck first. Somewhere in northern Italy, the exact location is disputed by historians. Lost in fragmentary sources, Spartacus encountered the consular armies. Plutarch tells us what happened. Spartacus defeated both consuls. Think about what this means. Rome had sent its highest magistrates with its best troops, 20,000+ professional legionaries, and Spartacus, leading an army of former slaves, most of whom had been agricultural workers just months before, crushed them. The sources don't give us the full narrative of these battles. We don't know if Spartacus fought both consular armies together or separately. We don't know his tactics in detail. But we know the outcome. Gellius and Lentulus were both routed. Their armies scattered. The consuls fled with remnants of their forces. It was an astonishing achievement. A former slave, a gladiator, who should have died in an arena for Roman entertainment, had defeated the consuls of Rome in open battle. The road to the Alps now lay open. Northern Italy stretched before Spartacus's army. Beyond the mountains was Gaul, was freedom beyond Rome's borders. Escape was within reach. And then Spartacus did something that has puzzled historians for 2,000 years. He turned around. He didn't cross the Alps. He didn't lead his army to freedom. Instead, according to all our sources, he marched his 40,000-strong army back south, back toward Rome, back into the heart of Italy. Why? Why? The ancient sources speculate but don't know, and modern historians can only guess. Because the truth died with Spartacus. Plutarch suggests that Spartacus wanted to continue north, but his army refused. That the victory over the consuls had made them overconfident. That they wanted to stay in Italy and continue winning, continue raiding, continue their rebellion. Appian suggests something similar, that the slaves had grown confident from their victories and no longer feared Roman power. But think about what this might really mean. Spartacus's army was not homogeneous. It contained people with different goals and different homelands. The Thracians, like Spartacus, could return to Thrace if they escaped Italy. The Gauls could return to Gaul. But what about the Italian-born slaves? The people who had been enslaved in Italy, raised in Italy, who had no other homeland? Where would they go if they crossed the Alps? And what about the women and children? Could an army of 40,000 people, including non-combatants, really cross the Alps? Those mountains were difficult enough for trained Roman legions to traverse. What chance did a rebel army with families in tow have? Perhaps Spartacus feared that dispersing his forces would leave them vulnerable. That Rome would hunt down small groups once they separated beyond the Alps. That staying together, staying strong, was the only way to survive. Or perhaps, and this is pure speculation, perhaps Spartacus had come to see this rebellion as more than just an escape attempt. Perhaps his victories had changed his thinking. Perhaps he had begun to believe that something greater was possible, that they could actually threaten Rome itself. Now, we don't know. The sources don't tell us. They only tell us what he did. He turned south, and when news reached Rome that Spartacus's army was marching back toward the capital after defeating both consuls, panic set in. Picture Rome in the spring of 72 BCE, the most powerful city in the Mediterranean world, capital of an empire that stretched from Spain to Syria. But now an army of rebellious slaves was marching toward it, and that army had defeated every force Rome had sent against it. The Senate declared a state of emergency. They stripped the defeated consuls of their commands, a humiliating rebuke but necessary. New leadership was needed, a new commander who could succeed where others had failed. They chose Marcus Licinius Crassus. Listen closely now, because Crassus is important to this story. Understanding him helps us understand what happened next. Crassus was one of the richest men in Rome, perhaps the richest. He had made his fortune in brutal, clever ways. During Sulla's dictatorship, when Rome was tearing itself apart in civil war, Crassus had profited from the proscriptions, the death lists that condemned thousands of Romans to execution and confiscation of property. Crassus bought up the estates of the condemned at a fraction of their value, and became immensely wealthy. He owned silver mines worked by thousands of slaves. He owned rental properties throughout Rome. He commanded a private fire brigade that would rush to burning buildings, buy them from desperate owners at bargain prices, then extinguish the fire and rebuild at profit. Crassus was ambitious, ruthless, and competent. He wanted military glory to match his wealth. He wanted a triumph, a victory parade through Rome to cement his status among Rome's elite. He craved the respect that came from martial achievement, not just money. The Senate's desperation was his opportunity. The Senate granted Crassus extraordinary powers and authorized him to raise new legions. He assembled an army of 8 legions, perhaps 40 to 50,000 men. He also took command of what remained of the consular armies that Spartacus had defeated, adding their survivors to his force. Crassus now commanded the largest Roman army assembled in Italy in a generation. More soldiers than Spartacus, better equipped, better trained, better supplied, but Crassus knew that numbers alone wouldn't be enough. Spartacus had already defeated larger Roman forces. Morale mattered, discipline mattered. His soldiers needed to fear their own commander more than they feared the enemy, so Crassus revived an ancient, terrible Roman punishment, decimation. One of his legions had broken and fled in an early skirmish with Spartacus's forces. Not a major battle, but their cowardice could not be tolerated. Crassus assembled the entire legion, approximately 4,000 men. He divided them into groups of 10. In each group, one man was selected by lot, and then in front of the entire legion, those 400 men were beaten to death by their 9 comrades, 400 Roman soldiers killed by their fellow soldiers as punishment for the legion's cowardice. It was brutal. It was terrifying. It was exactly what Crassus intended. The message to his army was clear. You should fear me more than you fear Spartacus. You should fear disobeying orders more than you fear death in battle. After the decimation, Crassus's legions never broke again. With his massive, disciplined, terrified army, Crassus began hunting Spartacus through Italy. Spartacus, meanwhile, continued south. His army raided as it marched. They struck at estates and towns, freeing more slaves, gathering supplies, staying mobile. They were not trying to hold territory. They lacked the numbers and logistics for that. They were a moving force, a rebellion on the march. But Spartacus was running out of Italy. He had marched south down the length of the peninsula. By late summer of 72 BCE, he had reached the far south, the region called Bruttium, the toe of the Italian boot, where the land narrowed between two seas. And here, facing the sea, Spartacus made a crucial decision. He would cross to Sicily. Think about what this meant. Sicily, the large island south of Italy, separated from the mainland by a narrow strait. Sicily had a history that Spartacus certainly knew. The First Servile War from 1305 to 132 BCE had erupted there, a massive slave uprising that had nearly liberated the island before Rome crushed it. The Second Servile War from 104 to 100 BCE had happened there too, another huge rebellion of agricultural slaves. Sicily's slave population was enormous. Hundreds of thousands of enslaved people worked the vast estates that produced grain for Rome. If Spartacus could reach Sicily, if he could spark another uprising there, the rebellion could grow exponentially. An island of freed slaves defended by Spartacus's army might actually be sustainable, might actually work. But there was a problem. Spartacus had no ships, and you cannot walk to Sicily. The strait between Italy and Sicily, the Strait of Messina, is 3 kilometers wide at its narrowest point, too far to swim with an army. Spartacus needed vessels. He negotiated with pirates. The sources both Plutarch and Appian mention this, tell us that Spartacus made a deal with Cilician pirates. These pirates controlled much of the eastern Mediterranean. They raided Roman shipping, sold captives into slavery, operated outside Roman law. They had ships. They had the means to transport an army. Spartacus offered them payment, money and gifts, gathered from the rebellion's raids. In exchange, the pirates would ferry his army across the strait to Sicily. The pirates agreed. They took Spartacus's payment, and then they betrayed him. They took the money and sailed away, leaving Spartacus and his army stranded on the Italian shore, staring across the narrow strait at Sicily. So close, so reachable, yet utterly beyond their grasp. It was a devastating blow. The plan to reach Sicily, to expand the rebellion to an island with hundreds of thousands of potential recruits, was ruined by simple greed. The pirates had taken their profit and abandoned the rebels to their fate, and that fate was closing in, because Crassus, with his massive army, had been shadowing Spartacus's march south. And now, with Spartacus trapped in Bruttium between the sea and the pursuing Roman legions, Crassus saw his opportunity. He ordered his army to build a wall, not a small fortification, not a simple barricade. A massive wall stretching across the entire narrowest part of the Italian peninsula, from the Tyrrhenian Sea on the west coast to the Ionian Sea on the east, a wall to trap Spartacus in Bruttium. Plutarch describes this wall, 15 feet high, topped with a wooden palisade, backed by a deep ditch, and the wall stretched 50 kilometers, about 30 miles from sea to sea. Think about the engineering required, the labor, the logistics. 40,000 Roman legionaries digging trenches and raising walls and cutting timber and building watchtowers, all while keeping watch for attacks from Spartacus's army on the other side. It was one of the most impressive military engineering projects of the ancient world, built in weeks by soldiers who were trained not just to fight, but to build. And its purpose was simple: to trap Spartacus, to cut him off from the rest of Italy, to besiege him in Bruttium, without supplies or reinforcements, to wait for winter and starvation to do Crassus's work for him. Behind the wall was freedom, was Italy, was the possibility of continuing the fight. Ahead was the sea, impassable, and around was Crassus's army, waiting. Spartacus was cornered. For the first time since the rebellion began, he was truly trapped. Winter was coming, late 72 BCE, and the campaign season was ending. Snow would fall soon even in southern Italy, and Spartacus's army, now back up to perhaps 60,000, with the survivors of Crixus's forces who had rejoined him, needed food. Bruttium had been stripped by both the rebels and the Romans. The land couldn't support 60,000 people through winter. Starvation was coming. Despair was settling in. Spartacus needed to break out. He needed to breach that wall, and he needed to do it before his army fell apart or Rome brought even more forces to bear. The rebellion has reached a crisis point. The walls close in, but Spartacus has not yet made his final stand. Winter, 72 BCE. Spartacus and 60,000 followers trapped in Bruttium behind Crassus's wall. Picture their situation. Behind them the sea, impassable without ships. Ahead, 50 kilometers of fortification, 15 feet high, backed by trenches, guarded by 40,000 Roman legionaries. Around them the stripped countryside of southern Italy, barely enough food to last weeks, let alone months. Crassus was content to wait. Winter would do his work for him. Starvation, disease, despair. Eventually the rebel army would weaken, fracture, collapse. Then he would move in for the kill and claim his triumph. But Spartacus had not survived 2 years of rebellion by accepting defeat. On a winter night, the sources tell us it was snowing. Rare for southern Italy, but not impossible. Spartacus made his move. He ordered his men to fill in a section of Crassus's trench. Not with earth or stone, but with whatever they had. Trees they cut down, dirt and rocks, and the bodies of dead animals, horses and mules and cattle that had died or been slaughtered. Anything to create a bridge across the ditch. And then, in darkness, in snow, Spartacus led his army in a breakout. Plutarch describes what happened. The rebels attacked the wall at night, in the worst weather, when Roman guards were least alert, when visibility was nearly zero. They poured across the makeshift bridge they had created. They scaled the wall. They burst through. Crassus's guards tried to stop them, but were overwhelmed. 60,000 desperate people fighting for their lives against surprised sentries in darkness and snow. It was no contest. The sources tell us that 1/3 of Spartacus's army made it through. 20,000 people escaped the trap and broke back into Italy proper. But what about the other 40,000? The sources are silent. Did they remain trapped? Were they killed in the breakout attempt? Did they scatter into Bruttium's hills, hoping to evade Roman patrols? We don't know. The ancient historians, writing for Roman audiences, cared only about what threatened Rome. Those 40,000 disappear from the record, their fates unknown. But 20,000 escaped with Spartacus. 20,000 who had broken through what should have been an impregnable wall, who had proven once again that they would not be contained, would not surrender, would not accept the fate Rome decreed for them. Crassus was furious. His perfect trap had failed. The wall he had built at such cost, the siege he had planned so carefully, breached by slaves in a single night. He mobilized his legions and began pursuit. North through Italy, chasing Spartacus's army. And this time Crassus was not going to let them escape. But Spartacus faced a new problem. His army was fracturing again. Remember Castus and Gannicus, the other two Gallic leaders who had escaped from Batiatus's ludus with Spartacus and Crixus? They commanded their own forces, Gauls and Germans who followed them specifically. After breaking through the wall, as the army marched north, Castus and Gannicus separated from Spartacus with approximately 12,000 fighters. The sources don't explain why. Perhaps the same reasons that had driven Crixus to separate earlier. Different strategies, different goals, different visions. Perhaps they wanted to raid while Spartacus wanted to march quickly. Perhaps they simply wanted to command their own forces rather than remain subordinate to the Thracian. Whatever the reason, the split was disastrous. It divided Spartacus's army yet again, and Rome, learning from how Gellius had defeated Crixus, moved quickly to exploit the division. Crassus didn't chase the smaller force himself. He sent one of his legates, his subordinate commanders, named Gnaeus Tremelius Scrofa, with 2 legions. Perhaps 8 to 10,000 men, according to Plutarch. Spartacus tried to negotiate with Crassus. Think about what this means. After 2 years of rebellion, after defeating multiple Roman armies, after proving that slaves could organize and fight and win, Spartacus tried to talk, tried to find a way out that didn't end in mass death. What were his terms? The sources don't tell us specifically, but we can infer. Perhaps Spartacus offered to leave Italy peacefully, if Crassus would allow it. Perhaps he offered to disband his army, if their freedom would be guaranteed. Perhaps he simply asked for terms of surrender that wouldn't end in crucifixion for all his followers. Crassus refused. According to Appian, he refused to negotiate at all, not to conquer it. That was impossible with 8,000 men, but perhaps to threaten it, to force Rome to negotiate by bringing the war to their doorstep. To create panic that might give him leverage, he marched his army north toward the capital, got within perhaps 50 kilometers of the city walls before Crassus's pursuing forces caught up with him. Or perhaps, and this is speculation, perhaps Spartacus himself decided that there was no escape, that Rome would hunt them forever, that running was pointless, that the only option left was to fight with whatever dignity remained, and die as warriors rather than fugitives. The sources place the final battle in Lucania, in southern Italy, in the spring of 71 BCE. Exactly where is uncertain. Appian doesn't specify, and other sources are vague or contradictory, but somewhere in the hills of southern Italy, Spartacus turned and faced Crassus's army. 8,000 rebel fighters against 40,000 Roman legionaries. Before the battle, according to Plutarch, Spartacus killed his own horse. Think about this image. A commander killing his mount in front of his army. When asked why, Spartacus reportedly said that if they won, there would be plenty of Roman horses to take, and if they lost, he would not need a horse. It was a statement, a promise that he would fight on foot alongside his men, that he would not flee, that he would stand and face whatever came, victory or death, with no thought of escape. The battle began. The sources give us fragments of what happened. Plutarch says Spartacus tried to fight his way directly to Crassus himself, that he pushed through the Roman lines, cutting down soldiers, trying to reach the Roman commander. If he could kill Crassus, perhaps the Roman army would break. Perhaps there was still a chance. Appian tells us that Spartacus fought with incredible ferocity, that he cut his way through Roman ranks like a hero from Homer, that he killed centurion after centurion as he pushed forward. But there were too many Romans. For every one he killed, 10 more took their place. The mathematics of the battle were inexorable. 8,000 against 40,000, exhausted rebels against fresh legionaries, desperation against discipline. The rebel line began to break. Men fell. The formation collapsed. What had been a battle became a slaughter. Plutarch tells us that Spartacus continued fighting even as his army disintegrated around him, that he fought until he was surrounded, that he went down on his knees, still swinging his sword, still killing Romans, until finally he was overwhelmed and cut down. His body was never found. According to Appian, after the battle, when the Romans searched the field of corpses for Spartacus's body to display as a trophy, they could not identify him. He was lost among the thousands of dead, one corpse among multitudes. Perhaps this was intentional on Spartacus's part, fighting in the thick of battle where he would not be singled out, ensuring that even in death he would not become Rome's trophy. Or perhaps it was simply the chaos of the slaughter, so many bodies hacked and bloodied that identification became impossible. Either way, Spartacus died fighting, not captured, not executed, not crucified like so many of his followers would be. He died as a warrior, sword in hand, surrounded by enemies he had pulled down with him. The battle was a massacre. Of Spartacus's 8,000 fighters, Appian tells us that about 6,000 survived. They fled the battlefield, scattered into the countryside, tried to escape. Crassus's legions hunted them. Over the following days and weeks, most were captured. 6,000 prisoners. 6,000 former slaves who had followed Spartacus, who had believed freedom was possible, who had fought and lost. Crassus ordered them all crucified along the Appian Way. The Appian Way was Rome's most important road. It ran from Rome south to Capua and beyond, the same road Spartacus and his fellow gladiators would have travelled when they first came to Batiatus's Ludus, the road that connected Rome to the south. Along this road, at regular intervals from Capua to Rome, a distance of about 200 kilometers, Crassus crucified 6,000 prisoners, one every 50 meters or so, 6,000 crosses, 6,000 dying men. Crucifixion was Rome's punishment for rebellious slaves. It was slow, it was agonizing, it was public. The condemned were nailed or tied to wooden crosses and left to die over days. Death came from exhaustion, asphyxiation, dehydration, exposure. It was meant to be as painful and humiliating as possible. And 6,000 crucifixions along Rome's busiest road ensured that every traveller, every merchant, every citizen who journeyed south would see them, would see what happened to slaves who rebelled, would see Rome's power, Rome's vengeance, Rome's message to every enslaved person in Italy. This is your fate if you resist. The crosses stood for months, perhaps years. The bodies rotted, birds fed on the corpses. The message remained, do not rebel. But there was one final twist to this story. One last piece of Roman politics that coloured how the rebellion was remembered. Pompey the Great, arriving from Spain with his legions, had not participated in the final battle. He arrived too late. Crassus had already defeated Spartacus. But as Pompey marched south, his forces encountered some of the fleeing survivors from Spartacus's army, perhaps 5,000 men trying to escape north. Pompey's legions intercepted them and killed them all. And then Pompey, with characteristic political skill and shamelessness, sent a dispatch to the Senate claiming credit for ending the rebellion. According to Plutarch, Pompey's message said, "Crassus has defeated the rebels in battle, but I have plucked up the war by the roots." This was a calculated insult. Crassus had done all the work, built the wall, pursued Spartacus across Italy, fought the final battle. But Pompey, through his family connections and political influence, claimed the decisive victory. The Senate, caring more about politics than truth, granted Pompey a triumph, a victory parade through Rome for his campaigns in Spain. They acknowledged his role in ending the slave revolt. They celebrated him. Crassus received only an ovation, a lesser honour, a minor parade. No chariot pulled by white horses, no full celebration. It was a slight, a political humiliation. Crassus never forgot it. His rivalry with Pompey would shape Roman politics for years to come. Both men craved glory. Both competed for power. And that competition, combined with the ambitions of Julius Caesar, would eventually lead to civil war and the end of the Republic. But that was in the future. In 71 BCE, the slave revolt was over. Spartacus was dead. 6,000 of his followers were crucified along the Appian Way. The survivors were hunted down or melted back into slavery. The rebellion that had terrified Rome for 2 years was finished. Or was it? The memory remained. Spartacus's name survived. For 2,000 years, his rebellion has been remembered, celebrated, debated, used as a symbol by revolutionaries and freedom fighters across the world. To Rome, he was an enemy, a threat to civilization, a reminder of the dangers lurking beneath their society's foundation. But to those 6,000 who followed him to the end, to the 70,000 who joined his rebellion over its course, to the millions of slaves across Italy who heard about him, what was he to them? A hero who showed that resistance was possible, that slaves were not just property, but human beings who could organize, fight and win, that Rome's power was not absolute, that freedom, even temporary, even doomed, was worth fighting for. The rebellion ended in blood and crucifixion. But the question remains, echoing across 2,000 years, was Spartacus a hero or an enemy? Before you answer, let us consider what the ancient sources themselves tell us. What did the Romans, his enemies who wrote the histories we still read, actually say about him? Plutarch, writing about 150 years after Spartacus's death, describes him with remarkable respect. Remember, Plutarch was writing for Roman and Greek audiences. He had no reason to praise a rebel slave, yet he calls Spartacus a man of intelligence and culture superior to his condition. He emphasizes his courage, his strength, his leadership. When describing how Spartacus divided plunder equally among his followers, Plutarch presents this as evidence of fairness and wisdom, not as weakness or demagoguery. When recounting the final battle, Plutarch writes of Spartacus fighting like a hero from epic poetry, trying to reach Crassus himself, cutting down Roman soldiers with superhuman courage. This is language normally reserved for Roman generals, for celebrated commanders. Yet Plutarch uses it for a Thracian slave, Appian, another ancient historian, also writing long after the events, similarly acknowledges Spartacus's qualities. He calls him intelligent, strong, courageous. When describing the rebellion's course, Appian doesn't hide Roman defeats or minimize Spartacus's victories. He presents them factually, acknowledging that this slave commander repeatedly outfought and outmaneuvered Rome's armies. Even Florus, who is hostile to the rebellion and calls it shameful for Rome, cannot avoid acknowledging Spartacus's military skill. He admits the rebellion was a serious threat, that Spartacus was a formidable opponent. Why does this matter? Because these were Romans writing for Roman audiences. They had every incentive to diminish Spartacus, to present him as a monster or a barbarian or a lucky fool. They could have written him out of history entirely. After all, slaves didn't write histories, and defeated rebels were typically forgotten. But they didn't. They preserved his story. They acknowledged his qualities, even through their hostility, even through their cultural assumption that slavery was natural and rebellion was criminal. They could not help but recognize what Spartacus was: exceptional. Now consider what Spartacus actually did. According to these sources, he escaped from enslavement. 78 men with kitchen knives broke out of a gladiator school that should have been escape-proof. This alone was remarkable. Most escape attempts by gladiators failed, but Spartacus succeeded. He defeated Glaber's 3,000 with just 78 fighters. By using terrain, surprise and tactics, descending Vesuvius on woven vines, attacking from an unexpected direction, he overcame a vastly larger force. He built an army. Within months he had transformed from a fugitive to a commander of tens of thousands. This required leadership, organization, strategy. It required convincing desperate, diverse people to trust him, follow him, fight for him. He maintained discipline and unity in an army of former slaves from a dozen different cultures. The sources tell us he divided plunder equally, settled disputes, kept order. For 2 years he held together a force that by all rights should have fragmented immediately. He defeated multiple Roman armies: Glaber, Verinius, both consuls, Gellius and Lentulus, professional soldiers commanded by Rome's highest magistrates. Spartacus beat them all. He broke through Crassus's wall, that 50-kilometer fortification built specifically to contain him, breached in a single night through courage and desperation. And when the end came, when defeat was inevitable, he fought to the death. He did not surrender. He did not beg for mercy. He killed his horse, charged the Roman lines, and died fighting. These are facts. The ancient sources, hostile though they were, preserved them. These are things Spartacus actually did. Now consider what he was fighting against. Roman slavery in the 1st century BCE was not the distant, abstract institution we study in history books. It was immediate, brutal, omnipresent. Millions of human beings, historians estimate that perhaps 1/3 of Italy's population were slaves, lived as property. They had no rights under law. Their masters could beat them, rape them, kill them with no legal consequence. Slaves existed at the complete mercy of their owners. Gladiators like Spartacus had it particularly bad. They were purchased specifically to die for entertainment, trained to kill each other while crowds cheered. Their lives measured in how many fights they could survive before an opponent's sword or a net or a trident ended them. Agricultural slaves worked from sunrise to sunset in fields, growing food they would never enjoy, producing wealth they would never share. They were often chained while they worked, housed in barracks little better than prisons, branded or tattooed to mark them as property. Household slaves lived under constant surveillance, subject to their masters' whims. Sexual abuse was routine and legal. Families could be separated at any moment. Children sold away from parents, spouses torn apart with no recourse, no appeal, no hope of reunion. This was the system Spartacus fought against. This was the order he challenged. When slaves joined his rebellion, they weren't just seeking personal freedom, they were rejecting the entire structure that defined them as less than human. Think about the courage this required. Every slave in Italy knew what happened to rebels. The punishments were designed to be as terrible as possible to discourage resistance. Crucifixion, being torn apart by animals, torture, public execution. Yet 70,000 people at the rebellion's height chose to follow Spartacus anyway, chose possible freedom over certain bondage, chose to fight even knowing the likely outcome was death. What does this tell us about Spartacus? About what he represented to them? The sources don't give us the voices of the slaves themselves. We don't have their testimonies. We don't know their names beyond a handful of leaders. History, written by the literate elite, rarely preserves the perspectives of the powerless, but we have their actions. 70,000 people joined Spartacus. They fought for him. Many died for him. This was their answer to whether he was worth following, whether his cause was worth dying for. Now consider the Roman perspective. Why did they fear him so much? It wasn't just about military defeats, though those were embarrassing enough. It was about what Spartacus represented, the possibility that the foundation of Roman society could crack. Rome's economy depended on slavery. The vast agricultural estates that fed Rome's population were worked by slaves. The mines that produced metals were worked by slaves. The workshops that manufactured goods were staffed by slaves. Wealthy households were maintained by slaves. If slavery became unstable, if slaves across Italy rose up inspired by Spartacus's example, the entire Roman system would collapse. The republic would starve, the economy would fail, the social order would disintegrate. This is why Rome responded with such overwhelming force. why both consuls were sent against Spartacus, why Crassus was given 8 legions and extraordinary powers, why 6,000 prisoners were crucified along the Appian Way in history's largest mass execution. Rome wasn't just defeating an enemy army. They were making a statement. This can never happen again. This can never be allowed to succeed. The cost of rebellion must be so terrible that no slave ever again dares to follow Spartacus's example. Did it work? In the short term, yes. There were no more major slave rebellions in Italy. The crucifixions were effective terrorism. For generations, slaves remembered and feared, but in the longer term, Spartacus's name survived. His story persisted, and for 2,000 years, rebels and revolutionaries have claimed him as a symbol. In the 18th century, during the Haitian Revolution, Toussaint Louverture was called the Black Spartacus, as he led enslaved Africans to freedom. In the 19th century, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels invoked Spartacus as a symbol of class struggle, of the oppressed rising against their oppressors. In the 20th century, the Spartacist League in Germany took his name for their revolutionary movement. The 1960 film starring Kirk Douglas brought Spartacus to millions, presenting him as a hero fighting for human dignity. Even today, Spartacus remains shorthand for resistance, for the fight against impossible odds, for refusing to accept injustice even when acceptance would be safer. But we must be careful here. We must not let later appropriations obscure the historical reality. Spartacus was not fighting to abolish slavery as an institution. Nothing in the ancient sources suggests he had an ideological opposition to slavery itself. He was fighting for his own freedom, and the freedom of those who followed him. This is understandable, even admirable, but it's not the same as fighting to end slavery everywhere. Spartacus was not trying to overthrow the Roman Republic and establish a new government. He wasn't a revolutionary in that sense. The sources suggest he wanted to escape Italy, to return to his homeland, to leave Roman territory entirely. When that became impossible, he fought to survive. Spartacus led thousands to their deaths. This is simply true. Of the perhaps 70,000 who joined his rebellion over its course, most died, whether in battle against Crixus, Castus and Gannicus, whether in the final battle against Crassus, whether crucified afterward along the Appian Way. The rebellion failed, and the price of failure was measured in tens of thousands of corpses. A Roman in 71 BCE, looking at 6,000 crucified slaves along the Appian Way, would ask, was Spartacus responsible for these deaths? Did he lead these people to pointless destruction? Would they have been better off accepting their enslavement rather than following him to slaughter? These are hard questions, uncomfortable questions, but we must ask them if we want to judge fairly. So let us consider both sides. Let us hear the prosecution and the defense. The prosecution. Those who would condemn Spartacus would say, he led a violent rebellion that caused immense suffering. The sources tell us his army raided estates across Italy, killed Roman citizens, destroyed property. This brought war to peaceful territories. Innocent people died because of his actions. He gave his followers false hope. He must have known deep down that Rome would never allow his rebellion to succeed, that eventually the full force of Roman military power would crush them. Yet he led them on anyway, let them believe freedom was possible, and ultimately led them to their deaths. He split his army repeatedly, weakening it. First Crixus, then Castus and Gannicus. Each split led to disaster for those who separated. A more competent leader might have maintained unity, might have found a way to save more lives. He turned back from the Alps when escape was possible. The sources suggest his army could have crossed the mountains in 72 BCE after defeating the consuls. Instead, he turned south, back into the heart of Italy, prolonging the war and ultimately ensuring its bloody conclusion. He refused to negotiate when Crassus might have offered terms. Perhaps a settlement could have been reached. Perhaps at least some of his followers could have been saved. Instead, he chose to fight to the death. The result: tens of thousands dead. The rebellion crushed. Rome's power demonstrated more brutally than ever, and slavery in Italy continued unchanged for centuries after Spartacus's defeat. This is the case against him. Now hear the defense. Those who would celebrate Spartacus. He fought against one of history's most brutal systems. Roman slavery was not a mild institution. It was violent, dehumanizing, built on the premise that some human beings were property to be used and discarded at will. Spartacus refused to accept this. That refusal alone was heroic. He gave his followers 2 years of freedom, 2 years where they were not slaves, not property, not subject to the whip and the chain, 2 years where they made their own choices, fought their own battles, lived as free human beings. For people who had spent their entire lives enslaved, those 2 years might have been worth any price. He defeated Rome's armies repeatedly. He proved that slaves were not inferior, not incapable, not deserving of their bondage. He showed that given the chance, given weapons and training and leadership, enslaved people could match or exceed their supposed masters in courage and skill. He maintained remarkable discipline and fairness, the equal division of plunder, the organization of a diverse army, the strategic competence that let him outmaneuver trained Roman commanders. He was not a mindless rebel, but a skilled leader. He died fighting rather than surrender. He could have fled after the final battle, could have tried to escape, to save himself. Instead, he killed his horse, charged the Roman lines, and went down swinging. He shared the fate of his followers rather than abandoning them, and his legacy survived. For 2,000 years, people have remembered Spartacus, have drawn inspiration from his example, have seen in his rebellion proof that resistance is possible, that oppression can be challenged, that the powerless can fight back. Would the 6,000 crucified along the Appian Way have preferred never to rebel? We cannot know, we cannot ask them, but they chose to follow Spartacus. They chose to fight, and perhaps they believe those 2 years of freedom, however it ended, were worth it. This is the case in his favor. Both arguments have weight, both contain truth, and this is why, 2,000 years later, we still debate Spartacus's legacy. Consider what you value most. Is it the preservation of life at any cost? Then perhaps Spartacus was wrong to rebel, wrong to lead so many to their deaths when acceptance would have meant survival, however constrained. Or do you value dignity above survival? Do you believe that freedom, even temporary, even doomed, is worth fighting for? Then perhaps Spartacus was right to fight, right to give his followers the chance to die free rather than live in chains. Consider the context. Spartacus lived in a world where slavery was universal, accepted, seen as natural by most free people. In that context, his rebellion was extraordinary, revolutionary, a challenge to the fundamental assumptions of his society. We live in a world where slavery is illegal, condemned, recognized as a profound evil. Our judgment of Spartacus is shaped by this perspective. We see him through the lens of our own values, our own time, our own struggles. Is that fair? Can we judge a historical figure by modern standards? Or must we evaluate him only within his own context? There are no easy answers. But we can say this. Spartacus was real. He existed. He fought. He led a rebellion that terrified Rome and inspired millions across history. Whatever judgment we make, we cannot ignore him, cannot dismiss him, cannot pretend his story doesn't matter. The fire in this ancient study burns low now. The flames have dimmed to embers. Outside, somewhere beyond these walls, dawn approaches. You have heard the evidence. You know what Spartacus did. You understand what he fought against, and what his rebellion cost. You have heard both sides. The ancient sources preserved his story, but could not answer whether he was right or wrong. 2,000 years of debate have not settled it. Different cultures, different times, different people have given different answers based on their own values, their own struggles, their own understanding of what makes life worth living. Now the question passes to you. Whatever you decide, remember this. 70,000 people chose to follow him, chose to fight for him, chose possible death over certain enslavement. Their actions speak across the centuries, telling us something profound about the human need for dignity, for autonomy, for the chance to shape our own fate, even when the odds are impossible. Spartacus died 2,000 years ago. His body was lost among the corpses of the final battle. His followers were crucified along the Appian Way, their bodies left to rot as a warning. But his name survived. His story persisted. And as long as people fight against oppression, as long as the powerless resist the powerful, as long as anyone believes that some things are worth dying for, Spartacus will be remembered. The story ends here. The fire burns to embers. The question remains. Rest now, sleep if you wish. And when you wake, if you choose to judge, remember that Spartacus was not a symbol or a myth. He was a man. His followers were real people. Their struggle was real, and the question they posed to us about freedom, about sacrifice, about what price we will pay to remain human, that question is as urgent today as it was 2,000 years ago. The judgment is yours.